The scandal began quietly, not with gunfire or an intercepted cable, but with a man walking into a U.S. Naval Intelligence office carrying a briefcase full of secrets. His name was Jonathan Pollard, a young civilian analyst whose mind was as brilliant as it was reckless. And what he was about to do would ignite one of the deepest fractures ever to exist between Mossad and the CIA. Pollard joined U.S. Naval Intelligence in the early 1980s, assigned to a section that analyzed Soviet submarine movements and Middle Eastern military capabilities. His colleagues described him as eccentric, always talking about Israel, geopolitics, and his fascination with espionage. But that fascination turned dangerous. Pollard began leaking highly classified documents, not for money, not for ideology, but because he believed Israel wasn't getting the intelligence it needed to survive. At least, that's what he told himself. The truth was murkier. While Pollard claimed his motivation was loyalty to Israel, his behavior was reckless. He downloaded tens of thousands of pages of U.S. intelligence reports, satellite images, intercepts, code names, and passed them to Israeli handlers working out of a covert office in Washington under a scientific liaison cover. But this wasn't an official Mossad operation. It was run by a smaller, highly secretive Israeli intelligence unit under the Defense Ministry, led by Rafi Eitan, a veteran of Mossad and one of Israel's most experienced operatives. Eitan wasn't supposed to be running spies on U.S. soil. But when it came to intelligence, Israel had always blurred the lines between allies and targets. At first, the operation was a success. Pollard supplied Israel with detailed intelligence about Arab military developments, Soviet arms transfers, and even American reconnaissance data that helped Israeli forces anticipate regional threats. But soon, his behavior drew attention. He was working late hours, requesting access to files beyond his clearance, and copying massive amounts of data. The CIA and naval counterintelligence began to notice anomalies. Documents missing, requests flagged. By mid-1985, a quiet internal probe began. And then came the moment that exposed everything. On November 21, 1985, after weeks of surveillance, Pollard and his wife Anne were caught trying to seek asylum at the Israeli embassy in Washington. The guards refused them entry. Within minutes, FBI agents surrounded the compound and took Pollard into custody. The moment the handcuffs clicked, a silent war began, not between enemies, but between partners. When the CIA learned of Pollard's arrest, the initial reaction was disbelief. Israel, their supposed ally, had been running an espionage operation inside the United States, the very heart of their intelligence network. Langley's analysts combed through the damage assessment. The findings were devastating. Pollard had handed over intelligence so sensitive that it revealed U.S. surveillance methods, collection priorities, and signals interception technologies. This wasn't just a leak, it was a hemorrhage. According to later assessments, the stolen intelligence compromised not only U.S. interests, but also joint NATO operations. The CIA believed the Soviet Union may have indirectly gained access to parts of the data, though that claim remains disputed. Within days, the CIA's director at the time, William Casey, personally demanded answers from Tel Aviv. The Israelis, caught off guard, at first denied involvement, but under mounting pressure, they admitted Pollard had been working for a secret rogue unit. It was damage control, a statement designed to contain the political fallout. But in private, CIA analysts knew that no operation of this scale could have been run without high-level approval from within Israel Fantuanfi. ES intelligence establishment. The U.S.-Israel intelligence partnership, once strong, nearly collapsed overnight. Information sharing was suspended. Joint projects were frozen. And in Langley's halls, the phrase "never again without verification" became an unofficial policy. CIA counterintelligence officers began scrutinizing Israeli diplomats and defense attachés stationed in Washington. Several were quietly recalled by Tel Aviv to avoid further embarrassment. For Mossad, this scandal was catastrophic. Even though the operation was technically outside its direct chain of command, it tarnished Israel's entire intelligence community. The CIA no longer trusted that Mossad would respect boundaries. And for Pollard, the consequences were even more severe. In 1987, he was sentenced to life in prison under the Espionage Act, the harshest penalty ever given to a spy for a friendly nation. In the years that followed, the Pollard case became more than just a scandal. It became a symbol of broken trust. Behind closed doors, intelligence channels between Mossad and the CIA were rebuilt, but only through backdoor mechanisms. Both agencies continued to share intelligence on counterterrorism, Soviet operations, and later, emerging threats like Hezbollah. But the tone had changed forever. Every exchange came with caveats, every meeting with mutual suspicion. In 1996, a secret CIA assessment still described Israel as a significant counterintelligence concern, despite being one of America's closest allies. It wasn't hostility, it was caution born of betrayal. Meanwhile, within Israel, many viewed Pollard as a hero, a man who had sacrificed himself for national security. The Israeli government eventually granted him citizenship, and years later pushed for his release. But for the CIA, that campaign only deepened resentment. To them, Pollard wasn't a patriot. He was a reminder of how allies could become adversaries overnight. Few people outside intelligence circles know this, but the CIA quietly struck back. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Langley began limiting the scope of intelligence it shared with Israeli counterparts. Sensitive technology transfer programs were restricted, and American operatives were warned to assume that every conversation is being recorded. The Israelis noticed. Mossad operatives who had once been welcomed into CIA facilities found themselves meeting in neutral locations, sometimes in Europe, under layers of pre-arranged protocols. The message was clear: cooperation continued, but the trust was gone. Jonathan Pollard's story became a cautionary tale for both sides. For the CIA, it reinforced the belief that even friendly nations spy on one another, a rule of intelligence that has no exceptions. For Mossad, it was a painful reminder that loyalty to one nation can blur the lines between patriotism and recklessness. Over time, the two agencies resumed collaboration, particularly after 9/11, when terrorism forced intelligence services worldwide to cooperate again. But the ghost of the Pollard case lingered for decades. Even after Pollard's release in 2020, CIA officials remained wary. One retired counterintelligence officer put it bluntly: "Allies share intelligence. They don't steal it." That's the line Pollard crossed. By the early 2000s, Mossad and the CIA reached a quiet understanding, not through treaties or press releases, but through actions. They didn't fully trust each other, but they needed each other. The Middle East was changing, Iran was rising, Syria was collapsing, and cyber warfare had replaced traditional espionage. So, they made a deal only spies could understand. We don't forgive, but we move forward. A cold wind brushed across Washington, D.C. in the winter of 1956 when a coded cable arrived at CIA headquarters. It was from Tel Aviv, encrypted, urgent, and signed with a cipher the Americans barely recognized. What it revealed shocked the analysts reading it. Israel had launched a covert operation in Egypt without informing its most powerful ally. The CIA realized something it had long suspected. The Israelis were running their own game, even against friends. Before we get deep into this secret war between two supposed allies, a rivalry fought through back channels, betrayals, and assassinations. Make sure you're tuned in till the end. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's the real story of how trust turned to treachery between the CIA and Mossad. When Israel declared independence in 1948, the new state faced isolation and hostility on all sides. The U.S. saw Israel as a useful regional partner, a small but strategic outpost in the Middle East. But what Washington didn't realize was that the young Israeli intelligence service, soon to be known as Mossad Le'aliyah Bet, and later simply Mossad, was already operating with a fierce independence. By the early 1950s, both agencies, the CIA and Mossad, had begun a cautious relationship. They exchanged small favors, intercepted radio chatter, regional maps, and tips about Soviet weapons shipments. On the surface, they were partners, but behind closed doors, each viewed the other with suspicion. The CIA considered Mossad reckless, driven by ideology rather than intelligence discipline. Mossad viewed the CIA as arrogant, a global superpower that underestimated Israeli capabilities. And from that tension, a quiet rivalry was born. The first real fracture appeared during the 1956 Suez Crisis. Without informing Washington, Israel joined Britain and France in a plan to invade Egypt after President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The CIA learned of the operation only after Israeli tanks were already advancing across the Sinai. In declassified cables later reviewed by U.S. historians, CIA analysts described the act as an intelligence betrayal of the highest order. Israel had acted independently, defying Washington's control. To Mossad, it was a test, to prove that Israel didn't need permission to act on its own security interests. This single decision planted the seed of distrust that would grow for decades. By the 1960s, cooperation resumed, but under layers of suspicion. The CIA quietly supported Mossad's growing operations in the Middle East, particularly in tracking Soviet influence. Israel, in return, provided intelligence on Arab military buildups and the movements of Soviet advisors in Egypt and Syria. Yet, Mossad had its own motives. Its agents operated not only in the Arab world, but also inside the United States, recruiting members of the Jewish diaspora and business executives to gather sensitive information about U.S. arms sales and Middle East policies. According to multiple declassified U.S. counterintelligence files, Mossad's Washington station was far more active than officially acknowledged. CIA officers were aware and uneasy. One memo from 1968 bluntly read, "Israeli intelligence operates in America as though it were on home turf." The partnership was starting to resemble a chess game, each side smiling in public while hiding their next move. The biggest rupture came in the late 1960s over Israel's nuclear ambitions. When CIA analysts discovered that Israel was secretly developing a nuclear weapons program at the Dimona reactor, they immediately reported to the White House. Israel, under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and later Golda Meir, denied everything, even to their closest allies. But Mossad's internal reports, later leaked by defectors, show that they were well aware of CIA surveillance flights and infiltration attempts. They even launched counterintelligence measures against U.S. operatives in Tel Aviv and the Negev Desert, effectively blocking American inspections. In one of the most telling episodes, CIA field agents attempting to photograph the Dimona facility from Jordan were nearly ambushed. Their operation compromised, many believed, by Mossad's counter-espionage division. For Washington, it was clear. The Israelis weren't partners anymore. They were players in their own right, and very capable ones. By the early 1970s, as the Yom Kippur War broke out, the CIA and Mossad were technically still cooperating. But beneath the surface, each agency suspected the other of withholding crucial intelligence. Mossad claimed it warned the CIA of a joint Arab offensive in October 1973. The CIA, for its part, argued that Mossad's warning came too late, possibly even deliberately delayed to force U.S. intervention once Israel was under attack. To this day, historians debate that claim. But what's undeniable is that the mistrust between Langley and Tel Aviv deepened beyond repair during that war. Afterward, the CIA established tighter restrictions on intelligence sharing, while Mossad expanded its own independent networks across Europe and the Middle East. They were still allies on paper, but in reality, both sides were spying on each other. As the 1970s faded into the Cold War's final years, the CIA and Mossad learned to coexist in a strange, shadowy balance. They shared intelligence about Soviet activity and terrorist groups. Yet both planted moles, intercepted each other's communications, and ran secret missions without coordination. Former intelligence officers would later call it the friendliest spy war in history. But beneath that description was a bitter truth. Neither side truly trusted the other, and it was only a matter of time before that hidden rivalry exploded. Not in the deserts of the Middle East, but in the streets of Washington itself. It began with a flicker. A screen went black for a fraction of a second at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility in central Iran. Engineers dismissed it as a power glitch, but within days, centrifuges began spinning out of rhythm, accelerating, decelerating, and finally tearing themselves apart. No one knew it yet, but the first cyber weapon in history had just been unleashed. And behind that invisible attack stood two familiar names, Mossad and the CIA. By the mid-2000s, the US and Israel shared a single, overriding concern: Iran's nuclear program. Intelligence reports suggested that Tehran was months away from achieving full enrichment capability. For Washington, that meant a future threat. For Israel, it meant existential danger. Mossad's intelligence networks had already penetrated Iran's scientific circles. They had photographs, names, and even blueprints of the centrifuge systems used at Natanz. The CIA, meanwhile, had the technology and global reach to turn that intelligence into a weapon. And so, in a series of secret meetings in 2006 and 2007, both agencies began a collaboration so ambitious that even their allies in Europe weren't informed. The code name, Operation Olympic Games. At its heart was a shared goal: to stop Iran's nuclear progress without firing a single bullet. Inside a secure lab at the U.S. National Security Agency, a small team of programmers worked alongside Israeli cyber experts from Unit 8200, Israel's elite signals intelligence branch. Their mission? Create a virus capable of sabotaging industrial systems without being detected. Mossad contributed the human intelligence, layouts of Natanz, names of engineers, the brands of programmable logic controllers used by Siemens to run the centrifuges. The CIA and NSA brought the cyber capabilities, zero-day exploits, code injection methods, and the infrastructure to mask the virus's origin. The result was Stuxnet, a digital ghost. It was unlike anything ever seen before. A self-replicating worm designed not to steal information, but to destroy machinery while leaving operators blind to what was happening. To Mossad, it was a masterpiece. To the CIA, it was an experiment. Getting Stuxnet into Iran's network was the hardest part. The Natanz facility was air-gapped, completely isolated from the internet. But Mossad had a way in, through a network of double agents and contractors working for companies that supplied Natanz. They inserted infected USB drives into computers connected to the facility's systems. The moment one of those drives was plugged in, Stuxnet came alive, spreading silently across systems, mapping the network, and identifying its targets. Then it struck. Over the next months, centrifuges began to fail inexplicably. Iranian scientists replaced them, only for the new ones to malfunction again. The beauty of the attack was in its deception. Stuxnet made control panels show normal readings, even as the machines were destroying themselves. Iranian engineers suspected sabotage, but had no proof. The virus had no digital signature, no traceable origin. To the outside world, Iran's nuclear program appeared to be struggling from within. Technical errors, not sabotage. That illusion was exactly what Mossad and the CIA wanted. Inside Tel Aviv's Mossad headquarters, celebrations were quiet but intense. The operation was working. According to later reports, nearly 1,000 centrifuges were damaged beyond repair, setting Iran's nuclear progress back by at least a year. But beneath the surface of cooperation, mistrust simmered again. Mossad believed that without Israeli intelligence, the virus would never have worked. The CIA, on the other hand, viewed it as an American technological triumph and a tool they could use again elsewhere. Still, the operation continued in secrecy until something went wrong. In 2010, Stuxnet escaped. A software engineer in Belarus discovered a strange, sophisticated worm spreading through computers worldwide, from India to Indonesia. Cybersecurity analysts soon realized it wasn't an ordinary virus. It was a military-grade cyber weapon. When the worm's code was dissected, its purpose became clear. It specifically targeted Siemens controllers, the same type used at Natanz. Within weeks, global media connected the dots. All eyes turned toward Washington and Tel Aviv. The denials came swiftly. Neither the US nor Israel claimed responsibility. But experts knew the truth. The level of sophistication, the resources, the geopolitical motive, it could only have been them. For Mossad, it was the worst-case scenario. Years of secrecy blown in a moment of code. For the CIA, it was embarrassment on a global scale. Iran's reaction was immediate. The government accused Israel and the United States of cyber warfare and vowed retaliation. Tehran launched its own cyber division, targeting Western banks, oil companies, and even Israeli infrastructure. The cyber arms race had begun. Behind closed doors, the CIA blamed Mossad for being too aggressive with deployment, arguing that Israeli technicians had altered parts of the code to cause more visible damage, which ultimately made detection easier. Mossad, in turn, accused the CIA of mishandling containment protocols. Their alliance, already fragile since the Pollard affair, fractured once again, this time in cyberspace. After Stuxnet's exposure, both agencies quietly began developing their own cyber arsenals, parallel projects, often targeting the same regions but without coordination. Mossad's Unit 8200 focused on offensive cyber intelligence, developing tools for digital espionage and data exfiltration from enemy systems. The CIA's cyber branch shifted toward covert surveillance, embedding malware in networks across the Middle East and Europe. Even as they publicly cooperated against mutual threats like Iran or Hezbollah, each side now guarded its digital secrets more fiercely than ever. The lesson from Stuxnet was clear. Even shared victories could turn into mutual vulnerabilities. While the world debated who created Stuxnet, the deeper truth was that the operation had changed warfare forever. It blurred the line between espionage and aggression, showing that wars no longer needed missiles or troops. A few lines of code could do the same damage silently. Iran rebuilt its centrifuges within a year, but the precedent was set. Cyber weapons became the new frontier, and Mossad and the CIA were now its pioneers and its rivals. Years later, anonymous intelligence officials would describe Operation Olympic Games as a success that ended in disaster. It delayed Iran's nuclear ambitions, yes, but it also opened Pandora's box. Cyber warfare was now out in the world, beyond control. Even within the corridors of Langley and Tel Aviv, some operatives quietly wondered if they had gone too far. They had created a weapon that couldn't be contained, and in the process, reignited a rivalry that had never truly died. It's 3 a.m. in Langley, Virginia. A dimly lit control room hums with quiet urgency. On one screen, satellite feeds over Tehran. On another, encrypted intercepts traced to Tel Aviv. A CIA cyber analyst leans closer, realizing the impossible. The network they're tracing doesn't belong to Iran. It belongs to Mossad. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. And it changed the relationship between America and Israel forever. In the years following Operation Stuxnet, public cooperation between Mossad and the CIA appeared stronger than ever. Joint press releases, joint counterterrorism operations, and shared technology projects were publicly praised. Behind the curtain, though, the situation had changed. Documents leaked through internal whistleblowers, and later confirmed by cybersecurity experts, revealed that both nations had begun spying on each other in secret. Mossad's Unit 8200 quietly monitored U.S. defense communications in the Middle East. The CIA, meanwhile, expanded its SIGINT, Signals Intelligence presence in Israel, embedding surveillance within what were supposed to be joint systems. The two allies had officially entered a new kind of Cold War, one that existed in the shadows, invisible to the public. Around 2014, reports began surfacing of mysterious hacks against American and Israeli tech contractors, firms that handled defense software and satellite communications. At first, both sides blamed Iran or Russia, but internal analysis told a different story. Some of the code matched patterns known only to Western intelligence. It wasn't foreign, it was familiar. The CIA traced fragments of the malware to servers used in previous Israeli cyber operations. Mossad, in turn, found traces of American code embedded in communications traffic linked to their European networks. Both sides denied involvement. Both sides knew the truth. The betrayal was silent, but total. For decades, Mossad had been America's closest regional partner. The CIA relied on Israeli intelligence to navigate Middle Eastern politics, from Hamas to Iran's Revolutionary Guard. But Mossad began to suspect that U.S. officials were deliberately withholding intelligence on Iran's secret talks with European powers and the Obama administration's early moves toward a nuclear deal. From Tel Aviv's perspective, the U.S. had betrayed them by negotiating in secret with their greatest enemy. From Washington's perspective, Mossad was sabotaging diplomacy by leaking classified information to pressure Congress and the media. For the first time, the two nations' intelligence agencies were working against each other's political interests. Not for them. Nowhere did this hidden rivalry play out more dangerously than in Syria. As the civil war raged, Mossad conducted surgical strikes against Iranian and Hezbollah targets, often without prior U.S. approval. The CIA, meanwhile, had its own covert operations supporting rebel factions, some of which clashed indirectly with Israeli objectives. Declassified satellite imagery later showed that both agencies were running overlapping surveillance missions in the same regions, sometimes within miles of each other. To the outside world, the U.S. and Israel were united against common enemies. Inside the world of intelligence, their field agents were playing a quiet chess match, each side trying to anticipate, monitor, and sometimes counter the other's moves. Every few years, one name resurfaces that reminds both nations how deep this mistrust runs: Jonathan Pollard. The former U.S. Navy intelligence analyst, arrested in 1985 for spying for Israel, was a ghost neither agency could escape. When Pollard was finally released after 30 years in prison, the CIA protested Israel's public celebration. For Mossad, Pollard's case was ancient history, a story of loyalty misunderstood. For the CIA, it was proof that even the closest allies can become enemies overnight. That shadow of betrayal continues to shape every classified handshake between Langley and Mossad headquarters. In the 2020s, the battlefield moved almost entirely online. Israel's Unit 8200 became one of the most advanced cyber intelligence agencies in the world, conducting surveillance, counterterrorism, and offensive cyber ops far beyond its borders. The CIA followed suit, launching Project Raven and other digital espionage programs across the Middle East and Europe. Ironically, both sides often used the same technologies, the same contractors, and sometimes even the same vulnerabilities. That overlap blurred the line between cooperation and competition. There were even whispers from inside sources in Europe that American and Israeli cyber teams occasionally crossed into each other's networks during simultaneous intelligence-gathering missions. Each side pretended not to notice. Each side kept records anyway. In today's intelligence landscape, Mossad and the CIA remain allies, officially. But their relationship has evolved from blind trust to strategic caution. Each shares information only as far as it serves the national interest. Each double-checks what the other provides. In private, analysts on both sides admit a simple truth. There are no permanent allies in espionage, only permanent objectives. That reality defines the new age of spycraft. Joint operations are no longer about shared loyalty, but shared necessity. The friendship remains, but so does the firewall between them. The story of Mossad and the CIA isn't one of heroes and villains. It's one of survival. Of two nations bound by common enemies, yet divided by their own ambitions. Every act of cooperation carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Every success carried a hidden cost. The operations that began in the deserts of the Middle East have now moved into digital networks and satellite orbits. Invisible wars that shape global politics without anyone knowing. And through it all, the question remains: when your ally knows everything about you, are they still your ally or your most dangerous rival? As the Cold War between spies continues in silence, one thing is clear. Mossad and the CIA's relationship redefined global intelligence forever. They proved that even friends in the shadows can betray each other under the same flag of secrecy. But the story isn't over. Because in espionage, every secret has another secret behind it. This was when allies betrayed each other, Mossad versus CIA, the untold story of friendship, betrayal, and silent wars in the shadows. Subscribe to Spy Wars, Declassified, because the next story will uncover a truth even intelligence agencies tried to bury.